Jesus is marching to the cross. The Passover meal is now over, has happened, and they're going to make their way outside. And this is about to become a very difficult night for Peter, where Peter is about to commit not one, but two great failures. 2 times he's going to do the wrong thing at the wrong time, and it sets up for chapter 21, the final chapter in John, this beautiful reinstatement and grace covering for Peter. It's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. I look forward to getting there in about 5 weeks. But we are in chapter 18. If you're just joining us, we're going through the Gospel of John, and we have finished the Last Supper, and now it's about midnight, a little bit after midnight, and they have gone out and are heading to their very special place. John chapter 18, if you got your Bibles, open up there, and it goes like this. After Jesus had said these things, meaning all of what he said at the Last Supper. Remember, Last Supper is 5 chapters, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. And so after Jesus had said these things, John says, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden, and he, his disciples, went into it. And so John doesn't tell us, but we know from the other gospel writers that this garden is the Garden of Gethsemane. It's a very special garden. Kind of saddened. We finally got the details of our Israel trip planned. The Garden of Gethsemane was one of my favorite places on the Israel trip to go and to visit. Obviously, with everything going on over there, our trip has been postponed. But we will go, Lord willing, we will go. Continue to pray for peace in Israel and everything that's going on. And so, since we can't go to Israel, I thought this morning I'd bring a little bit of Israel to you. All right, so it's going to be picture time with Uncle Joe here, and I want to share some of this with you so that you can. I want you to be there. I want you to feel this month of Jesus going to the cross and his commitment, his resolve, his love for you, which drove him there. And when you've been there, these places like this garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, Kidron Valley, you know where it's at. You can picture it. And so if you haven't been there, you can't. So let me help kind of bring it to you, okay? So here's the first thing that I want you to see is this is from up on the Mount of Olives, okay? So if you can picture Jerusalem over here, walls here, you come out of the walls and you come down through the Kidron Valley, and then you start to come up, and there's this mountain range here called the Mount of Olives. And at the base of the Mount of Olives is the Garden of Gethsemane, which the Garden of Gethsemane is full of olive trees, which is where the Mount of Olives gets its name from. And so this is us up on top of the Mount of Olives, not all the way quite up. You'll see a couple other pictures, looking out over Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock. Jerusalem is an amazing city, right? 3 religions, it's their home, or a religious city. For us, obviously, as Christian, the Jews, and for Muslims, that's the Dome of the Rock. The very recognizable dome, which is where the temple was, the Old Testament temple. That's where the temple when Jesus went into when he flipped the tables over. It's that spot. That's where they're going to rebuild the temple someday when Jesus is ready to return. And so much history. You can go to the next one. We just have a couple pictures here so that you can appreciate. You can kind of see the valley, the Kidron Valley. That's what Jesus crossed over. I think we got one more of these that is kind of a wider shot. Yeah, so it's a very it's a huge valley, this Kidron Valley. And it's interesting, Kidron means, in Hebrew, Kidron means dark or murky. And so the Kidron Valley, there's a little river there, a little creek that runs through it. And it would often be dark and murky. And the reason that the Kidron Valley was called Kidron, dark or murky, is because the temple that would have been there had a drain built from the altar where the sacrifices were made that ran out through the walls and out into the Kidron Valley. And so animal sacrifices, as the lambs were laid on the altar, the blood would literally flow out and flow into the Kidron River. Kidron means dark or murky. And so some theologians even see great significance here. It's Passover, right? Don't miss this. Jerusalem is abuzz right now because you have Jews coming from all other nations coming back to Jerusalem for Passover. Jesus just had the Passover meal with his disciples. He's the Passover lamb, and literally he is crossing over the murky waters himself, about to be the sacrificial lamb. The next day in Israel, in Jerusalem, there would be 200,000 lambs sacrificed to atone for the sins, celebrating Passover when God passed over in the Old Testament the nation of Israel and Egypt. And so here's Jesus passing over the Kidron Valley, which is going to be covered the next day, blood red from 200,000 lambs sacrificed, and he's crossing over to the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane. Let me show you a little bit about the Garden of Gethsemane. It's got these massive olive trees in it. Go ahead to the next one. They're scattered all throughout. Gethsemane, this is what Gethsemane means. Gethsemane means oil press. And so oil was a major commodity in the ancient world, right? This oil, this olive oil, they used for everything. They cooked with it, they cleaned with it, they cared for their skin, health care, doctors used it, they used it to fuel in their lamps. I mean, they used olive oil for everything. And so olive trees all over the place, and this Mount of Olives. And at the base of the Mount of Olives is this Garden of Gethsemane. You can go to the next one. There were these massive trees. I mean, look how thick that tree is. So, and scholars debate as to whether or not these are the original trees that were there 2,000 years ago when Jesus was there. Many say yes, it was. Interestingly, John here is going to leave out Jesus praying. The other gospel writers record that. John chooses to focus on Peter and the arrest and the denial, and he doesn't record Jesus praying. But you know that Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. You know that anytime, I've told you, anytime something significant happens in Israel, when you go over now 2,000 years later, they've built a church there. So there's all these Byzantine and Roman Catholic churches that have been built throughout the centuries, marking the significant things. You go where the Sermon on the Mount was, and the Mount of Beatitudes, there's a church. The Mount of Beatitudes, you go there. You go to the Garden of Gethsemane, there's a church. Oh, you can go to the next picture. That's the church. That's the base of the hill, the Mount of Olives. And to the left of the church is where the Garden of Gethsemane. That's the church. That's called the Church of All Nations. And so they built the church literally around a very important object. If you can go to the next one there, this is just a close-up of the church. You go inside this church, you can go inside the church, and they have it roped off or barricaded off is this giant rock that's on the ground. And what they say is that is the rock on which Jesus prayed on in the garden. Obviously, we have no idea of knowing. And if you get a real tour guide, they always tell you the truth. They're like, we don't know. And so, and whenever we go, we'll get a real tour guide that will tell us the truth. But, you know, tradition has it that this is the rock that Jesus prayed on. And so they literally built a church around the rock that Jesus prayed on. If you look up above, you can go to the next one. Above this little altar is this mural that's painted on the wall. I don't know if you all can see it, but like at the bottom of the blue part of the mural is Jesus kind of kneeling on the rock there. And so very, very special place. Jesus is heading here. I know this is a lot of background history stuff. I think it's interesting. I think it helps you know what's about to happen tonight as you talk about the garden and you talk about the Mount of Olives here. Mount of Olives is special. Not just because it was Jesus' favorite place to go, but it's also special. Anyone else know 1,000 Bible trivia points? What Mount of Olives, something very significant happened and will happen on the Mount of Olives. Anybody know? Yes, that's where the ascension happened, where Jesus ascended up into heaven, literally before his disciples' eyes on the Mount of Olives, and it's where he will return at his second coming. When we say Jesus is coming back, well, where's he coming back to? He's literally going to come back and land on the Mount of Olives. That's where he's going to come back to. Acts chapter 1, let's read both verses. First, the ascension verse. Acts chapter 1, this is after the resurrection. It says, after he had said this, he was taken up as they were watching. So the disciples are there and they're just watching. Jesus going up, right? A cloud took him up out of their sight. And while he was going, they were gazing into heaven. You just imagine Jesus going up and they start staring up into heaven. Suddenly, two men in white clothes stood by them. Two angels appear. And they said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up into heaven? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come in the same way that you've seen him going into heaven." Then they returned to Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day journey away. It's like a few hours walk to get from up on the Mount of Olives all the way down Kidron Valley back up into Jerusalem. And so the ascension happens there. And so when we go, you stand in that spot, and you like, this is where Jesus rose up. We did it in 2006. A photographer just happened to capture it. Right there's 2006 Joe and 2006 Deb on the left, and two of our other friends from a previous church. And so there we were, looking up at the spot up on the Mount of Olives, and then Jesus is going to return. Jesus is going to return. It says in Zechariah 14:4, "On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem to the east." So Jesus will return on that same spot on the Mount of Olives. So this very special spot, Garden of Gethsemane, Mount of Olives is the backdrop. You even just stop and think about the garden, and you think about the role that a garden has played in human history. I mean, human history began in the garden, right? The first sin, which set everything in motion, happened in the garden. The great deception happened in the garden. And where the first Adam failed in the garden, the second Adam, Jesus, will not fail in his garden. Right? Adam's sin in the garden brought death to all. Jesus' success or determination to go to the cross, because in a minute he's about to pray, and he's going to pray 3 times, and he's going to ask his guys to pray for me. He says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow." This is in Matthew 26. He says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." And in Luke 22, Luke tells us that Jesus at this point began to sweat drops of blood. So this is some unbelievable, agonizing, intense praying he's doing. He comes back, he finds this guy sleeping. He said, "Can't you guys even pray for an hour?" Kind of gives you an idea of when Jesus went to pray, how long he prayed for. Gets up, comes back to the spot, starts praying again. Right? All of this happening here in the garden. And so where Adam's failure in the garden brought sin, Jesus' commitment to drink the cup brings life. Right? The garden is very significant in the story of redemption. This garden is very significant. So just a little bit of Israel brought to you here this warm March morning. All right, so we'll get there, hopefully, Lord willing, someday. Let's get back to John. Tour time is over with Joe. All right, here we go. John 18, we're back in verse 2. They go into the Garden of Gethsemane, and it says, "Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples." Like, it was their favorite spot. It was their hangout. It was their coffee spot of the day. It's where they would go and just hang out together, retreat from the city, and kind of get up on the mountain and hang out in the garden. All right? Remember, Judas he left early. Last Supper, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. 13 is when Judas left. Jesus washed his feet, took some bread, dipped it in the oil, said, "The one I give the bread to is going to betray me," hands it to Judas. Remember? John 13, verse 30, it says this, "After receiving the piece of bread, he immediately left." And it was night, John tells us. So Judas goes out into the night to betray Jesus. This is now hours later. Judas has set it up, and now hours later, they're in the garden, and Judas knows exactly where to go. And here's one thing that I want you to see as we go through this passage. I want you to see who is in control. Because as the passage goes on, it seems like this is a bad night. It seems like the guards are in control. It seems like Jesus is losing control. As a matter of fact, this is what Peter thinks, that he's going to have to help Jesus out by his actions. We're going to see that. But I want you to notice who is in control this whole scenario. Jesus goes to the garden not to hide, but he goes to the garden to be found because he knows that Judas knows that's their spot. He goes to the most common, regular spot that they went to, the garden. And so can you go back to the previous verse for me, the previous slide? Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place. Why? Because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So listen, Jesus wasn't hiding in the garden. Jesus went to the garden to be found because he is in control of this whole situation. All right, verse 3. Verse 3 tells us Judas took a company of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests, the Pharisees. They came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. All right, so this is a cohort of combination of Roman guards. You got some Roman guards with the Jewish police, the Jewish temple police, the officials. The Jews had their own version of the cops. And so you got the Roman soldiers coming with the Jewish soldiers kind of coming together. And they come armed and they come ready to go, thinking they are coming after this rebel that they've been convinced is leading a revolution against leadership. Verse 4 says, Jesus, watch this, knowing everything that was about to happen to him, went out and said to them, who is it that you're seeking? I love this. Jesus goes out to them. He doesn't wait for them to come back into the garden and find them over in the corner. Jesus goes out to meet them. Jesus initiates the conversation. He's the first to speak. Jesus starts asking them questions. I just want you to notice this. Watch as it develops. Who's in control? So Jesus says, who is it that you're seeking? Verse 5, Jesus of Nazareth, they answered. I am he, Jesus told them. Judas, who betrayed him, was also standing with them. I am he. I am he. I am. Sound familiar? Should. Jesus said it 7 times throughout the Gospel of John. Remember we said he did 7 signs with 7 I am statements. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the bread. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the good shepherd. I am the gate. Right? 7 times he said I am. When he said those I am statements, it was hearkening back to the Old Testament. Remember we said when God showed up to Moses in the burning bush and tells him, go talk to Pharaoh. And Moses is like, I don't want to go talk to Pharaoh. And God's like, you're going to go. And Moses is like, well, who should I tell him is sending to me? And God said, tell him the I am has sent you. The name of God, Yahweh, I am, has sent you. And so all throughout John's gospel, Jesus is using God's name when he says, I am this, I am this, I am this. And now one last time, when they come and they say, who are you looking for? And they say, Jesus, and he says, I am he. And I'm telling you this has significance because look what happens next. Verse 6, when Jesus told them, I am he, they stepped back and fell to the ground. Now listen, do not think that this is some kind of reverent bow, right? That the soldiers who were coming to arrest, they didn't care. First off, the Jewish soldiers thought he was a blasphemer and taking credit for being God. They weren't going to believe him. And the Roman soldiers, believing their pagan Roman gods, they weren't going to bow down to this human man. And so they were not bowing down in reverence. They were knocked down by just the name of God being pronounced. That's what's happening here. They got knocked on their rears down. Soldiers, professionally trained soldiers. And it was at this point, I don't know about you, but if I was the soldier and I came to get this guy and I'm in this garden and all of a sudden he just says, I am he, and something knocks me down, I'm getting up and going the other way. I'm like, all right, you win, I'm out. Verse 7, he asked them again, who is it that you're seeking? Jesus of Nazareth, they said. I told you, I am he, Jesus replied. So if you're looking for me, let these men go. Jesus kind of pulls the original Obi-Wan Kenobi on them. These are not the droids you're looking for. If you're looking for me, let these men go. Why? This was to fulfill the words that he had said just earlier in the prayer when he said, I have not lost one of those that you've given to me. So notice this. Listen, even in the middle of about to be arrested and about to go through a trial, and he knows the death that's coming, he is looking out for his own. He is protecting his own. He is loving his own. And so nothing here is catching Jesus off guard, right? Jesus is not surprised by any of this. He goes out to them. He initiates the conversation. He's asking them questions. He's knocking them down with power so that they know who really is in control here. Not all you guards with swords is this little meek and lowly rabbi who knocks you down with words. He is in control of the whole situation. Remember in John chapter 10, Jesus said this, I lay down my own life. No one takes it from me. And I lift it up again on my own accord. Jesus is in complete control. Only Peter didn't quite see it that way. Peter thought Jesus wasn't doing so well, and he needed to lend Jesus a hand. Peter's going to help God out. And before we bust too much here on Peter and give him a hard time, I want to encourage you as you go through this. I'll help you. To see a little bit of Peter in yourself. Because I believe there's a bit of Peter in all of us this morning. And we'll see as we go just how much Peter is in us. Verse 10, it says this, Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name, John tells us, was Malchus. And at that, Jesus said to Peter, Put your sword away. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me? Right? I mean, so Peter is going to act. He's a man of action. He's not a man of thinking. He's a man of action. Peter's, goal is act first, think later. And it gets him into trouble, and it's going to get him into trouble here. And he's completely missing what God is doing here. I mean, Jesus just knocked them down with some words. Peter, I think he's doing okay. I don't think he needs your help. You ever feel like you need to help God out a little bit with what he's doing because he's not doing it good enough, or he's not doing it the way that you want him to do it? Like, God, I'm going to help you out with this. I'm going to take the wheel back here. I'm going to take control. God, it seems like you're not. You ever miss what God is doing? Do you think Peter is missing what's going on here? 100%. Even though Jesus just spent hours around the supper table saying, I'm going to be ready to go, I'm leaving, where I'm going, you're not going to come, you're going to see me, then you're not going to see me. Man, the whole thing, like, he just got done telling him he's going. Just a couple hours ago, Peter completely missed it. Here come the guys to take Jesus because Jesus said he's not going to be, and Peter's like, no. He completely missed what God is doing. And it made me wonder and made me think, to myself and now to you, how often do we miss what God is doing? I think we got to help God out a little bit. I began to write down reasons why I miss what God is doing. There's a lot. Let me share some with you, see if it resonates with you perhaps this morning. I miss what God is doing because I haven't taken time to sit down and just be with God and to listen to God, to even know what he's doing. I miss what God is doing because I have just been following my own natural thoughts and do what just makes sense, not God's thoughts. I miss what God is doing because my emotions often run strong, and I can be led more by emotions more than by not even just thinking, but more about what God is thinking. So emotions have the danger of taking you 2 steps away from the right thing, right? It's emotion-led rather than being thought-led. Not even just thought-led, what makes sense, but it's what is God's thoughts, right? So you're 2 steps away. Because even what I'm thinking, what makes sense sometimes, is not what God is thinking. Because it says in Isaiah 55, God's ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are not our thoughts. So, emotions is a big reason why we miss what God is doing, and Peter was full of them. Another reason I miss what God is doing is, frankly, just because I'm selfish. And I want what I want. And I want it when I want it. And I hate waiting. A lot of times I miss what God is doing because I'm just so busy and so hurried and just going. And I don't slow down enough to even know what it is that God wants. There's lots and lots of reasons that we can miss what God is doing. And Peter is example A here of missing what God is doing. And he thought he was doing a good thing, right? I mean, I'm sure in that moment, if you ask Peter, he's like, no, this can't happen. He's protecting his master. He's stopping the evil from, he's doing what he thought was good. But it was the exact thing that Jesus came to do, was to go to the cross. Right? Which is why he tells Peter, don't you know, I've got to drink this cup. I've got to drink the cup the Father's given me, Peter. Right? We talked about this before, the cup. The cup is an Old Testament reference, meaning always either suffering or judgment or both. And it was a metaphor that, if you're going through a season, you're drinking the cup of suffering. Or if there's judgment placed on you, you're drinking the cup of judgment. And Jesus is about to drink the cup down to the very last drop of the Father's judgment. But Jesus was innocent. That's right, he was innocent. And so the judgment that Jesus was about to drink was the judgment that you deserve, and the judgment that I deserve, and the judgment that every single human being that ever has lived and ever will live, the judgment of God on them for all of their sins, all of their rebellion, all of our defiance of God is stored up in this cup of wrath that God is about to pour out his Son on the cross. And Jesus says, I got to drink this. That's why I came, Peter. You can't stop this. You're missing the bigger picture. Makes me think about a principle that I think is important in today's culture. Because what Peter shows us is that, do you think Peter was sincere in what he was doing? I think he was incredibly sincere. He meant it with all sincerity. And here is, I think, a principle that I would encourage us to kind of meditate on in this, is that you can be sincere and still be sincerely wrong. Right? We hear that in our culture. Just live your truth and just be your truth. And it's like, listen, you can be sincere about something, sincere in your thoughts, sincere in your actions, but this is clear evidence that you can be sincere and be sincerely wrong. All right, so before we beat up on Peter too much, right, let's find ourselves in this story. You ever been sincere and been sincerely wrong? You ever spoke first and thought second? Right? You ever reacted rather than responded? You ever not practiced the pause? Take a break. You ever not respond? Let me take a day to respond to this email, to this voicemail. Right? You ever just acted rashly? You ever let your emotions get the best of you? You ever fool yourself into thinking you were doing right when it turned out you were actually doing wrong? I'm telling you, there's a bit of Peter in all of us, perhaps some of us even more than we really care to admit. You want to know the really crazy thing about this event here? Let me show you this. In Luke's gospel, Luke tells us that before Peter drew the sword, when the soldiers come and Jesus asked them questions, which, by the way, this little interaction, Jesus asking the question and the soldiers to get knocked down, that's only in John's gospel. Luke's gospel, we find something else. We find out that when the soldiers approach, that the disciples ask Jesus a question first. It's in Luke. Go ahead and put that verse up for me. Luke 22, it says, when those around him, meaning the disciples, saw what was going to happen, they asked, Lord, should we strike with the sword? Okay, so they saw the soldiers coming, and they stop and they ask Jesus a question. Is it now? Should we go? Like, hand on their hip, ready to. What verse is this? What verse number? 49. Next slide. What verse number? Very next verse. Then one of them struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. Now, Luke kindly does not throw Peter under the bus and just says one of them, but not his buddy John. John throws him right under the bus. It was Peter, tells what Peter did. But when you stop and you think about even how much crazier this story is that they put a question out to Jesus and didn't even wait for his response. Peter's just like, no, it's go time. Let's go. Let's do this. Didn't even give Jesus a chance to answer. You ever done that with God? God, I need you to, God, I'm praying that you would, God, please help me with, I'll just do it myself. You ever done that, God? I can't wait. Not waiting. Peter didn't even wait. He just jumped. And it was the wrong thing at the wrong time, and it's just crazy to me. And this isn't even the worst thing he does this night. Right? But the Lord, as I was reading this passage and studying it and praying through it, and I told you before, every Monday morning, tomorrow morning, I'll get up and just sit with the next week's passage and just read it. Lord, speak to me. Not give me a message. Just speak to me. And what does your word say? And what are you saying to me, your son? Not your son, the pastor, who needs a message. Just your son. Speak to me. And usually out of that conversation between me and God comes parts of the sermon or most of the sermon. And so as I've told you before, when God gets me with something, I feel the need to turn around and get you with it. And so let me get you this morning with it because he got me on Monday. And here's the question that I felt God prompted me to ask myself that I want to ask you to ask yourself, and that is this. How many foolish actions have we committed because we have just not waited on the Lord? Because we have not waited. I knew what the message was going to be. You didn't when we were singing the worship songs. And I wish I could tell you that Andrew and I are this in sync and we know exactly where we're going and what we're doing. But that's not. But when we sang that song, Hungry, and he paused there for a minute, and we didn't talk about this. He didn't know. And the pause was, and so I wait for you, and so I wait. And he said, let's sing that again. Do you remember that part when we sang this morning, so I wait? And I wonder how many of us lied there to Jesus during our worship time. Because I don't know about you, I don't like waiting. I don't like waiting on God. Sometimes we feel like God's watch is just slow. It's broken. Peter certainly did. It's crazy. Lord, is it go time? Should we draw it? Doesn't even give Jesus a chance to, let's just do this. I think there's a little bit of Peter in all of us this morning. One last other little side note here, and we'll get back to Peter's greatest mistake that he made that night. John tells us some details about this event. Says that cut off his ear, says it was his right ear, tells us that this was the high priest's servant. Even in parentheses gives us the name. This guy's name is Malchus. It's like, John, why are you giving us all these details about this guy? Why do you think Peter went after this dude? If you stop and you really think about it a little bit. And when you do a little digging, you found out a little bit about Malchus, who Malchus was. So the high priest was, for the Jewish people, for lack of a better word, the president of the day. right? It was the spiritual leader for the Jews. And we're going to get into who Ananias is and Malchus and Caiaphas and all these people next week in the sham of a trial that they put Jesus through at 3 o'clock in the morning. We're going to cover that next week. But Malchus was basically the high priest's right-hand man. Think of the best analogy today would be kind of like the spokesperson that does the press conferences for the president, right? You have to stand up there and you have to speak on behalf. Here's what the president did. Here's why the president did this. Answer all the questions. That was Malchus's kind of role, right? Which, by the way, who would want that job ever? Right? For any president, it would be a really difficult job. But that was Malchus's job. And so he would have been the one, remember when all this opposition began to grow against Jesus? And they began to go after him. They tried to remember there's times where they tried to grab him, and it says, and Jesus just slipped by, right? That would have been the high priest that decreed, it's time to go get Jesus. And it would have been Malchus that stood behind the podium and made the decree. The high priest says, we're going after Jesus now. The high priest says it's time. And so Malchus was the spokesperson of the ones who were against Jesus. And so my suspicion is it was not just some random person that Peter swung on. I mean, make no mistake about it. He wasn't trying to give him a shave. The reason he took off his ear is because he was going for the head. This was attempted murder by Peter, the fisherman. Was trying to kill this guy by taking him off at the head. And missed, hit his ear, and then John tells us Jesus healed his ear. And it's interesting that this is the last miracle Jesus would do on his time here on earth before the cross. This is his last miracle before the cross. I mean, the miracle of the resurrection, and then he does some really cool things after the resurrection. But this is his last miracle is the guy that's coming to take him to the cross is to heal his ear, to love and to serve. What a model and example Jesus even left for us as what it means to love your enemies, right? So back to John. Here we go. Here we go. Verse 11. At that, Jesus said to Peter, we already read this, put your sword away. Am I not to drink the cup the Father's given me? Then the company of soldiers, the commander, the Jewish officials arrested Jesus, tied him up. Jesus is bound, tied up. They led him first to Annas. We'll talk about this next week, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who, if you remember in John, again, we'll look at this next week, who advised the Jews that it'd be better for one man to die for the people. And now comes even Peter's worst part of the night. It wasn't even that was the worst part. Now it's really the worst part. Let's remind you, you know what's coming. If you've been around church at all, you know the great denial of Peter 3 times is coming. Let's remind you, though, it was only a few hours ago, again, back to John 13, the beginning of the Last Supper, where Peter said this, Lord, verse 37, Peter asked, why can't I follow you now? This is when Jesus started saying, I'm leaving, I'm going. Where I'm going, you can't come. And Peter's like, no, I will. I want to come with you now. I'll lay down my life for you. And Jesus replied, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, I tell you, a rooster will not crow until you've denied me 3 times. Early in the night, Jesus said that to Peter. And now here we are. Jesus is bound, and Jesus is being marched away out of the Garden of Gethsemane, down the Kidron Valley, back up into Jerusalem. And verse 15 says, Simon Peter was following Jesus. So Peter's following him as they go. And then it says, as was another disciple. We know anytime a disciple is talked about like this in John, that it's who? It's John. John never mentions himself. John's following along with Peter. That disciple, John, was an acquaintance of the high priest. So he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, right? A big area, maybe about the size of this room, with buildings all around it, right? Courtyard area. There would have been gates to get into the courtyard. And John is able to get in because he knows someone. And then in verse 16 it says, but Peter remained standing outside by the door. So the other disciple, John, the one known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the girl who was the doorkeeper, and brought Peter in. This guy's with me. He's going to come in. Okay. And as Peter's going in, the servant girl who was the doorkeeper said to Peter, you aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? I am not, he said. Denial number one. Now the servants and the officials had made a charcoal fire because it was cold. Charcoal fire. There's only 2 times in the whole Bible where the words charcoal fire go together. This is one. And in 5 weeks from now, we'll get to the second time. And the reason I'm telling you this is it's important. It's important. But I can't tell you now why it's important. So I want to make a big deal about it now so that in 5 weeks you'll remember. So I need you to remember charcoal fire, charcoal fire. Say it 5 times, charcoal fire, charcoal fire. Say it, right? Picture what it smells like. That'll help you. Picture the smell. Oh, it's 60 today. Maybe we start grilling tonight. Who uses charcoal anymore anyway? But remember the smell of a charcoal fire, right? Okay? Trust me, in 5 weeks, when we get to chapter 21, you're going to see something that's really cool. But I just want you to remember charcoal fire. You got it? Store it away. They were standing there warming themselves, and Peter was standing with them, warming himself. Verse 25, we're going to jump. John jumps back to the trial, to Peter, to the trial, to Peter. We're going to cover all trial stuff next week. Verse 25, Simon Peter was standing there warming himself, and they said to him, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you? They, plural. And he denied it and said, I am not. Now he's got multiple people. Hey, weren't you with a couple people? Look at him in the eyeball. Multiple. They're like sitting around the circle by the fire. They look up. Nope. Verse 28, watch this. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, said, didn't I see you with him in the garden? I mean, you kind of remember the guy who lopped off your relative's ear. If you there, you saw that, you'd remember that. Verse 27, Peter denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. Matthew tells us at this moment that Peter started cursing, swearing, calling down curses upon himself. I do not know the man. I swear it with a curse. The rooster crowed, and instantly Peter got it. Can you imagine how he felt at that moment when that rooster crowed? Luke fills in some details because Jesus was not, he was out in the courtyard. Jesus was in Annas' house. And there was either a window that you could look out into the courtyard or Jesus was being led out. Because Luke tells us that at that moment when the rooster crowed, Jesus turned and looked and locked eyes with Peter. Can you imagine Jesus looking at Peter? I don't know him. Peter looking at Jesus. Luke tells us that Peter went outside and wept bitterly. And there's something really odd, and it's always struck me as odd. I don't know if anybody else here, this whole thing of this rooster crowing, right? I mean, could not Jesus have picked anything to be the alarm clock to Peter that you messed up, right? Because if you stop and you think about it, a rooster crows at what time normally? Ish. Dawn. Right? It is not dawn. The sun is not up. It is the middle of the night. It is dark. They're making fires. It's cold. This rooster is way early. All right? If your rooster starts cockle-doodle-doing at 3 o'clock in the morning, he's going to be breakfast the next day. You're like, yeah, I'm done with you, buddy. This rooster is off, is early. And so why the rooster? I mean, could Jesus not have said, I tell you that the lightning will not flash in the sky before you deny me 3 times? He could have said that. He could have said, I tell you that clouds will not part in the sky. I tell you that it will rain by time. Like, he could have made anything be the symbol of the denial of Peter to get his attention. But he chose the rooster, and a rooster that is even off timing-wise. Why? Well, what does the rooster symbolize? What does it do when it does that little sound it does? It's the break of dawn. It's the sign of a new day, of a new beginning. Almost in the sense of that with God, his mercies are new every morning. With Jesus going to the cross, Peter, this is a new day. This is going to change everything. Your sin is about to be covered for on the cross, and you will have a new day. You will not stay in this position. And to me, this is why chapter 21 is such a beautiful chapter, where it reminds Peter exactly what he did. This rooster is a symbol of a new day, a new dawn, a new beginning, and that comes through Jesus. And so we're done. We're done here. I prayed and asked the Lord, what do we do with this? How do I wrap this up? How do I put a bow on this message? And what is the takeaway? And all week, he didn't give me one. I got nothing. I got no takeaway, which usually means he's got something just specifically for you. I'm not going to give it to you. He's going to give it to you. He's going to speak to you, and that's how I want us to end. Joe's going to shut up, and now we're going to let Pastor God pastor you. And I want you just to ask him some questions. Prayer team's going to come, and I'm going to give you some questions that I want you to ask God about, okay? About with this. Great failure in the garden that night. Betrayal by Judas. Failure on behalf of Peter. Disciples fell asleep while they were praying. Failure. And it's all covered over by the grace of God. All right? So, let me invite you to close your eyes and bow your heads. I just want you to ask the Lord, what do you want to say to me right now? Perhaps some of you feel like a Peter. You feel like a spiritual failure. The enemy constantly reminds you of your shortcomings, of your issues, of your stuff that you just continue to wrestle with, and you feel like a spiritual failure. And I think God's heart for you this morning is the crow of the rooster. That there's a new day, that there's a new beginning, that with Jesus, there's always grace to cover over your failure. Just confess that. Confess your failure again. For the 1000th time, confess it. Ask God to help you in the waiting. Ask him to reveal the ways of Peter in you, where you're going to take control, you're going to show God, you're going to be impatient, you're going to help God out with his job. Ask him just to reveal ways that you do that. And lastly, if you're here and you maybe even feel more like Judas than Peter, that you've kind of not just disobeyed God, but you've betrayed him. You don't even know you have a relationship with Jesus. You need to know that today the rooster is crowing for you as well, and that today can be the day of your salvation by coming back to Jesus, by saying yes to Jesus, by saying yes to the gift of eternal life in Jesus. He welcomes you back with open arms. But you need to come. You need to say yes. You need to want him and receive him and trust that he is the Son of God. He paid for your sins. He drank the cup of the Father's wrath for every sin you've committed and will commit. You need to receive that gift. And we'd love to help you do that. You can do one of three things. Stay. Keep talking to God. 2, come up for prayer. Don't be ashamed. Don't let your pride keep you from being prayed for. You need help with something, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, we'd love to pray with you. Come, ask for prayer. For the rest of you, I just want to thank you for being here with us. I pray that God will bless you and enjoy the rest of your weekend. You could leave quietly. Thank you.